How exciting to be together. Good evening, good afternoon to everyone. Shalom, shalom, larachok v'lakarov. Welcome one and all to our special program today. My name is Untitled, and I'm honored to be zooming in from my home in Chicago to serve as moderator for our topic that is on all of our minds, life after the pandemic. A shout out to our Facebook Live viewers too. Thank you. Hello to everyone in Facebook land. On behalf of the Massorti Foundation for Conservative Judaism in Israel, I want to thank you all for being with us. Thank you, of course, to CEO Yizhar Hess, Board Chair Sophie Feldman-Rafalovich, and the entire office in Israel for everything that they do today and every day. A few quick housekeeping rules. Because we have a robust turnout and so we can concentrate on hearing our speakers, I know you all know the drill, but participants will be muted. And you're invited to share your comments in the chat feature. And our amazing Tammy Gottlieb, Master of Digital Operations in Israel, and I will do our best to track comments, as can everyone in our panel. And we hope to have time to invite your questions for the last part of our program. We know that Zoom programs have their challenges, and we thank you in advance if we run into difficulties. We will try to keep this program at a high level and as engaging as possible. And we will also all embrace the pause. I would like to take a moment to wish those in need of healing a refuah shlema and offer a heartfelt hamakom yunachem to anyone who has lost a loved one during this very difficult time. The numbers are indeed staggering, as is the grief and loss I think we are all experiencing. But now we will turn to our panelists who can help us dream about a better future. They are three incredible thought leaders, from both sides of the pond. And I wish I could tell you everything that these experts have done to shape our world today. But we would be here until the wee hours of the morning, until Kriyat Shema Shel Shacharit. And for our friends listening in from Israel, it is nearly that time. A brief introduction of our panelists. A warm welcome to Mr. Erik Goldstein, who currently serves as Chief Executive Officer of New York's UJA Federation. He has previously served as Vice Chair of UJA's board on its executive committee, has chaired Lawyers Division, its Commission on Jewish Identity and Renewal, and its Global Strategy Task Force, among many other positions. He's been deeply involved in Jewish education and Jewish leadership in so many ways, and he cares so much for the millions of Jews around the world who are a part of Klal Yisrael. Thank you for being with us. A warm welcome to Dr. Michal Radoshitzky, a sought-after political scientist who teaches widely across Israel. She's a research fellow at INSS, the Institute for the National Security Studies, and is well-versed in Israel diaspora relations, Israel's standing in the UN, and how Israel is covered in the international media. Prior to joining INSS, Dr. Housekeeping Rules was the Israeli representative of the US-based Institute for Inclusive Security and managed the work of Forum Devorah, Women in Foreign Policy and National Security. Thank you for joining us. Welcome, Rabbi Dr. Elia Cosgrove. Rabbi Cosgrove, a prominent theologian and international religious leader, serves as the distinguished rabbi at the eminent Park Avenue Synagogue in New York City. He was ordained at JTS, earned his Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Chicago Divinity School. We miss you here. And is a prolific writer and speaker. Rabbi Cosgrove also serves in the broader community, sitting on the Chancellor's Cabinet of JTS, the editorial board of Conservative Judaism, the executive committee of the RA, the New York Board of Rabbis, and as a proud member of the board of UJA Federation of New York. It's so wonderful to have you. And so we begin. Last week, Time magazine featured an article by a Dutch historian, Rutger Bregman, entitled, "Now is the Moment to Change the World." Bregman quotes the brilliant 20th century economist Milton Friedman, who taught us, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change." Bregman expands his thoughts as follows. Right now, we are in the biggest crisis since the Second World War. The economic impact of COVID-19 is greater than the impact of the Great Recession of 2008, and may even be greater than the Great Depression of the 1930s. And if history teaches us anything, it's that the extraordinary things are possible. Everything depends on the ideas that are lying around. So I will ask you, Mr. Goldstein, to lead us off, and then I'll invite Dr. Xatoel Rդušičský to jump in afterwards with a political science perspective, and then Rabbi Cosgrove. And in your position as head of one of the largest federations in our country, what do you say? Does our world fundamentally need to change now in the aftermath of COVID-19? What ideas are lying around that might guide us towards a more stable future? And what will this mean for US-Israel relations in all of our spheres?
And all in 30 seconds or less. So first of all, thank you to the Massorti Foundation movement for inviting me to speak and participating with Michal and Eliot. Look, you know, this is still playing out, this crisis, in many respects. There's a lot of uncertainty still. How much longer will this continue? We've seen lots of positive downward trends in New York after a hellish couple of months, but in large parts of the United States, numbers are still going up. There's talk about a second wave, and no one knows when, or even in fact, if there'll be a vaccine. And so, although we obviously hope so, and hope so quickly. And so I can only tell you, and not having been around for the Great Depression or World War II, it's hard to really compare. I can tell you this is, in New York at least, a greater, the impact of this is leagues greater than the 2008 financial crisis or 9/11. It's the scale of this. You know, we support both social service network agencies and Jewish life institutions. And what's notable about this is how staggering the need is across all of our kinds of network partners. So in the social service area, whether it's devastating food lines, broken supply chain for food, the 40% increase and growing in need for food pantries, the mental health needs of our community, we've all been negatively affected by this somehow. Workforce development, there are 38 million Americans out of work, many Jews out of work, many people who were relatively getting by before, you know, paycheck to paycheck and even more, who are now very much newly vulnerable and suddenly vulnerable. On the Jewish life side, our Jewish community centers, anchors of Jewish life, are shut down physically. Their buildings are overwhelmingly closed. Our camps look like they're not going to be opening. You know, they spend 10 months of the year preparing for less than 2 months of activity. How do they sustain? Our synagogues, you know, are physically closed, even though maybe glimmer of reopening, the impact on day schools, yeshivas. So look, I think our world is fundamentally changed. And I don't think there's any question, but that the world on the day after is going to look differently on the day before March 1 in New York. And the hope, of course, is that the extreme need will lead all of us to innovate, to be more flexible, to be more cooperative. We all know that we have far too many Jewish institutions and could we rationalize ourselves in ways that effectively save resources so we can do it more effectively moving forward. That's obviously the goal. I think the ability is there, we'll see over time whether we meet the challenge of the moment. Because I fear if we don't, the consequences will be dire across both the social service worlds and our Jewish communal infrastructure.
Okay, so I suppose I'm up. So firstly, thank you for inviting me and for this wonderful conference. And it's so good to be among so many of you on the other side of the pond. It's 11 o'clock here in Israel, so it's quiet. My kids are asleep. I was at a conference earlier today when they came back from school. So this is another part of the corona reality where we're all working from home and everything's dynamic. So I would say if I had to look at the world and will the world change further to where we are now, I would probably divide my answer into a yes and a no, because there aren't simple answers and this really isn't a simple reality. So of course the world will change, at least in a technical manner, which means that we'll do things differently. There will be social distancing. We won't eat the way we eat now. Restaurants won't be packed. We'll travel differently. We'll Zoom much more, I believe. And I don't think all these things are necessarily bad. So I'm putting judgment aside. I'm trying to look at what the world will look at the day after. And I'm not even sure that there will be a day after. Maybe the day after will be life with coronavirus rather than life after coronavirus. We'll see how things develop. I think that another thing that we'll see here, and I think that at least it's become quite apparent in Israel, is that you can work from home. You can work from home. There's a lot more flexibility. I think the technological aspect has taught us a lot. I also teach at universities. None of my courses have been stopped. I'm teaching in Haifa. I'm teaching in Tel Aviv. And you know, when I teach in Haifa, I teach 1 day a week in Haifa from 8 in the morning till 12 at noon. And I'd leave my house at 7 in the morning and get back at about 1:30. And half the day is gone. And now, firstly, the online lessons, because it's a Zoom platform, it's much more condensed. So I'll only teach 3 hours, not 4. So there's a lot of versatility, and certainly things will change. At some point, the university authorities asked if there's any problem with my coming back physically, if I have background diseases or anything like that. So I checked with my students and I said to them, you know, if any of you feel uncomfortable with returning to class, a lot of them said to me, is there any way we can continue this format? It's much easier for us, it's better for us, it works well for us. So those things I don't think necessarily will change, but again, there's a versatility here, there's flexibility, there's new avenues that have opened up. In terms of international cooperation, and now I'm speaking as a political scientist, I think there's a lot to be learned, and here things will have to change. We've seen the UN Security Council completely paralyzed by this coronavirus disease, with China pulling in one direction and the United States pulling in another direction. On the other hand, we've seen international organizations like the World Health Organizations really pulling through here and making a difference. Of course, there's a lot of criticism about the World Health Organization. And this is, again, something that in the post-coronavirus world, we'll have to really think about. You know, how are we going to be able to beef up these international organizations that are on the ground and that can provide first aid, and how we can learn to cooperate with them. If it's China and the United States, then yes, we'll have to really put our minds together and think what we can do in that respect. Where the world doesn't need to change, and this we've seen this from the virus as well, is in just the human kindness and the sentiments, and you know, the Facebook groups that have popped up that are cross multinational, and we're seeing amazing initiatives from India through to Iraq, through to really all over the world, with just this human kindness that we're seeing everywhere. We're seeing it in Jewish communities, and we're seeing it elsewhere with people here, for example, just baking for medical teams, doing shopping deliveries, really helping the elderly, a lot of wonderful things that we really see just humanity kind of pulling through. And finally, and this is also just to address your question regarding the opportunities or the silver lining, and in this respect, it's what I see is Israel's relations with the diaspora. And here I can tell you that during this Zoom age, I've had the opportunity to converse with quite a few ministries, national institutions, and civil society organizations that work on this front of civil society and other institutions with diaspora jury. And this is a field that is truly blossoming now in Israel. I don't know if it's also because maybe we're 2 steps ahead of you in the curve and our lockdown measures are dissipating a bit, so we can perhaps open our minds a bit to look at the other side of the ocean really and understand what's happening with Jewish communities and where we can pull through. So I'm not sure if that's the reason, but I can tell you that a lot of attention is being directed towards Jewish communities on the other side of the world, and perhaps I'll speak a bit more about that later.
Thank you, Michal.
Okay. Michal, Eric, it's a pleasure and honor to share this, and Diane and the entire Massorti Foundation for bringing us all together. This is, I wish everyone an anticipatory good Yontif just around the corner with Shavuot, and it's really a joy to have people from all around the world. I see names of Chicago friends, of LA friends, New York and Israel friends, to be part of this special dialogue. So thank you to Massorti for making this possible. You know, you have Eric, who is one of the chief architects of American Jewry. You have Michal, who's a political scientist of note, and you got a rabbi. So I think it's my job to tell a joke, which is a very old joke. But as I was listening to Michal and Eric, I was reminded of that joke about the news that the world was going to be flooded in 3 days, and each religious leader came up and had a chance to address his flock, and the minister came up and said, the world will be flooded in 3 days. Everyone needs to perform acts of kindness, well, it didn't say acts of chesed, but let's bring one person closer to the other. Let's use these 3 days wisely. And then the priest gets up and says, the world will be flooded in 3 days. We have to pray to our Lord, our Savior. We have to do the will of God and connect to Scripture more closely. And then it's the rabbi's turn to get up and says, fellow Jews, it's 3 days before the world is flooded. We have to learn how to live underwater. That idea that we have to, I'm very careful. I'm very careful about saying with every crisis comes opportunity, or, there's always a silver lining, whether that's a 16-year-old for whom camp is canceled, or whether it's one of my congregational families who suffered the loss of a loved one. I think whatever your level of loss and disruption is, it sucks. There's no getting around it, economic, life, health, and I think that you have to allow that moment of grief to happen and affirm it, and not soft pedal it by saying, well, you're out of work, but at least you're not on a ventilator, right? It actually is not comforting. There's a reason why as Jews, when we arrive at a Shiva house, the tradition says, don't speak until spoken to. Because in a moment of loss, sometimes there's nothing to say. Thank God we have people like Eric who are doing, for lack of the words, the sacred work of the social service agencies. But I do, given that this moment is a time to be reflective about the world to come, or perhaps the hybrid world to come, as Michal sort of alluded to in her remarks, I think that there will be changes, and I don't think that they're all bad. And I think that the Jewish soul is attuned to this very task of reconstruction in the face of massive disruption. I think of the moment of the temple being destroyed and Yochanan ben Zakkai saying, "Give me Yavne and its sages," where a temple-based religion was reimagined as a religion of prayer and of mitzvot. I think of the institutions of American Jewish life that 100 years ago were created in the 19 teens. You know, the Federation, the JDC, the AJC, the ADL, go through the alphabet list of American Jewish life. That was a moment of massive transformation for American Jewry. So you can schrei Gewalt, and in some cases we need to, and we need to be eyes wide open, but you can also say, how am I going to learn from this moment of disruption? And how can we take the values of for me, it's as a Beit Knesset, as a Beit Tfilah, as a Beit Midrash, a house of learning, a house of study, and a house of prayer, and recognize that these values are constant, even though the modalities of their transmission can change, and perhaps should change, and organizational life can be transformed. I can give you a million examples, you know, and I do think it's a chance for collaboration. You know, I'm putting together a program with a reform colleague down the street from me, and normally we're sort of saying, well, is it going to be hosted here or is it going to be hosted by you? And we looked at each other over the Zoom call and said, there is no home and away now, right? We're all in a Zoom room. Let's just have the speaker speak to both of our communities all at once. When we had a Tekes Ma'avar at Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, the Orthodox colleague, the Reform colleague, and the Conservative colleague, we all got together because we said to ourselves, what are we doing wasting resources when Davka, on the time that we're celebrating our shared connection to Medinat Yisrael, that we should actually all be together and bringing our communities together. So I think, as Arik indicated, I think there are opportunities for collaboration, for being more tactical about resources, and I look forward to getting into Michal's question about what this means for diaspora and Israel relations as well.
Just to pick up for a moment on where Elliot left off so beautifully, you know, in the absence, exactly his point, in the absence of, you know, physical walls separating or even geographies separating, we've begun, and in fact, Elliot was the participant, we've had 8 pre-Shabbat community-wide gatherings with the most beautifully diverse, Jewishly interdenominational speakers. And we get comments after each week with people who are members of the Orthodox community or the Reform community saying, we're hearing from rabbis and leaders we've never heard from before, and how energizing it is to hear, and by the way, understand that the differences we think that exist are not quite as different, and that, you know, that movement's rabbi is not that different from my movement's rabbi. And the big question is, you know, Zoom technology allows for that, to where Elliot was saying we should go. What are the implications for America and Israeli Jewry? But I surely hope, it would be a tragedy of a different variety if that kind of interdenominational gathering going beyond the walls of our own synagogues, that this moment has made possible, and where people are looking for excellent content, would be a real tragedy if that would not continue into whatever the new normal is, because there's such a thirst and there's been such a receptivity to it. So I couldn't agree more with that comment.
Michal, I'll have you continue.
Okay, so I'll speak a bit about what I've been seeing here vis-a-vis Israel's relations, or perhaps even what Israel can learn and what Israel can offer to diaspora Jewry. So I'll speak on the one hand as not as a political scientist, and then I'll go into my political scientist hat. So one of the things we learned from Operation Protective Edge, I think, when we were researching what happened with communities who live in Otef Aza, right, on the skirts of the Gaza Strip, we see that there were 2 kinds of attitudes, okay? And this is based on what happened in Protective Edge, but of course we can, you know, we can copy paste with coronavirus. So there were those that evacuated, okay? There were missiles flying, and then they just got on buses and they went to their cousins, to their friends, to people on the other side of the country so that they can be away from the rockets. There were others that said, you know, we're staying here, this is our homes, we're not leaving, they won't chase us away, and we're not afraid of rockets, and a different attitude. I think at the end of the day, when there's a crisis, we need to be flexible. There's a saying, you know, that if you don't bend, you break. And when we look at what we call chosen, I'm trying to think of the English words, strength, resilience is the word, okay? We need to be, when we consider these kind of crises, our resilience is also tested by our flexibility. And how this has come to being here in this scenario, and what we Israelis can learn, or at least the general Orthodox, maybe the dominant Orthodox institution here in Israel. One of the things that was in the public discourse is regarding how are we going to pull off this Seder during coronavirus. And we looked to you in the diaspora, and we saw how you are Zooming your synagogue services, and how you are also, you know, you can Zoom in with the Seder. And even though perhaps you're not physically with your family, you can be with them through Zoom. Here in Israel, there was a lot of controversy about it, and the central institution, the Central Orthodox Rabbinical Institution, ruled that it's not in the halakha, it's not halachic to have a Zoom Seder. So again, the kind of the different attitudes, and one should perhaps ask oneself, where are we being resilient, and where can we do more to boost our resilience? And here again, I think we can look to you to learn from also how you have organized yourselves in your communities to withstand the challenges of coronavirus. So that's on a personal note. From a maybe more political science hat, one of the things I've been doing throughout this coronavirus, and we actually started just before coronavirus came in. Our first, I had a Jerusalem session where I was physically in Jerusalem, in the foreign ministry, at the Jewish agency, and about 2 days afterwards, the whole country was in lockdown. So I continued this research through Zoom. And basically, I've been speaking to a lot of different institutions, national institutions, ministries, and civil society organizations that in one way or another deal with diaspora Jewry. In the government, we have 4 different ministries who deal with different aspects of diaspora Jewry. We have the Foreign Affairs Ministry, okay, which obviously deals with such issues. We have a special ministry for diaspora affairs, diaspora Jewry. We have a new minister who maybe I'll speak about her in a couple of minutes. We have the Ministry of Aliyah and Absorption, and we have the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. Each of these ministries, and I've spoken to all of them over the past 2 months, each of them are concerned with different aspects that affect Jewish communities in the diaspora. For me, it was very heartwarming to see how much, and by the way, this research that I'm doing is not focused on coronavirus at all. This was in my yearly work plan, and I was planning to speak to them in any case, but each conversation began with a conversation about the current reality, coronavirus, how the state of Israel is pulling through, should pull through for Jewish communities in the diaspora. So that's one level, that's the ministerial establishment level. We also have organizations on the institutional, what we call national institutions, such as the Jewish Agency and others, Keren HaYesod and others. And here too, we see that all conversations opened with what these organizations are doing for diaspora Jewry now, how they can come through. And where it's been most prominent is on the civil society level. We've seen a Peoplehood Coalition emerge. Now, this has been going on for a while, but over the last few months, like I said before, it's just blossomed. And we have recruited and harnessed the technology. We have a group on Telegram and on WhatsApp, and it's very networked. And there is amazing support for each other. And we've tweeted all these different conferences. And today I participated in a full conference, a full one-day conference with 9 simultaneous panels that spoke about Israel and diaspora Jewry, not from a crisis point of view, but really from a point of view, from a peoplehood point of view. And I think there's a lot of attention, there's a lot of will, there's a lot of interest here in Israel, and we should certainly capitalize on this at the current, during this current reality and pull through. There's a lot of initiatives. I won't go into all of them. I will just mention, and I'll end with this. I think, again, I don't know, I've been in this field for quite a while, and I've never seen this field boom as it does now. Today, there was a roundtable with 30 organizations. It was led by the Histadrut, by Bushi Herzog, and along with our new Minister of Diaspora Affairs, who spoke amazingly and so openly about Israel's role vis-a-vis the Jewish diaspora. And one of the things that came out of that is that this will from now on be a bi-weekly kind of roundtable, which if you only knew how all these organizations, and less so the organizations, but the national institutions and the ministries that were also present in this roundtable don't usually converse and don't speak to one another. So just the fact that they all sat together and decided that this will be a bi-weekly forum is, wow, amazing news. So I'll end with that.
Either of our panelists want to respond, or else I have another question.
No, look, this is the right place to have the conversation. We're on a Massorti call. If you're on this conversation, then you're committed to the diaspora-Israel relationship. So if we're not going to talk about it here, when are we going to talk about it? You know, because of a nervous tick of a rabbi, you always have to put it in the shape of Torah. And it's not lost on me that this Shabbos, you know, because Shavuot is 1 day in Israel and 2 days in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora, that for the next, you know, stretch of time, we're going to be reading different parshiot, that Naso and the Yontif, and otherwise we won't be on the same page until it's corrected later down the line. And I think that this is sort of representative of not a more fundamental different page that we're on long before Corona hit. And I think that the question of to what degree, given political and religious considerations in Israel, diaspora Jewry's role has been transformed, and you know, the voice of, call it the liberal universal values of a large slice of American Jewry have voice in an Israel which whose leadership seems increasingly out of touch with the concern. You know, I've written extensively about this, about the different paths of the two Jewish communities, and just to say, this is why the work of Massorti is so important, because it is so critically important that my children, and Michal, I don't know if you have children, but that an Israeli children grow up identifying with a Jewish life and living that they share in common. It's not about me imposing my conservative Judaism in Israel or the other way around. It's that we need to make sure that 25 years from now, we're speaking the same language of peoplehood and religious life. And I'm worried because I think that, you know, there have been some efforts, you know, the tables have been turned from this sort of paternalistic big brother of American Judaism caring for its poor little, you know, brother in the Middle East, to a sense of certain segments, I don't want to say all segments of Israeli society, saying, we don't, not only do we not need you anymore, but the writing is on the wall for American Jewry. It's a matter of time before the anti-Semites or assimilation will get to you. You're certainly not going to inform our policy decisions. And by the way, we're going to tell you what does and doesn't constitute Jewish life, which causes American Jewry to bristle. And so I don't know, Michal, and to those listening, that was my assessment prior to Corona. I would like to think that there are opportunities for a course correction now that maybe didn't present themselves. I mean, I'll give you a small, very mundane one. My kids go to Jewish day school. Every single 11th, 12th grader, pre-college kid right now is looking at Bar Ilan, Hebrew U, Bina, you know, every Mechina program out there, because no one knows what's going on campus life. Is there a way that there are opportunities that would otherwise not be there to create bridges in the shetach, in the field, that maybe weren't viable pre-corona? Are there ways, Michal, that Israeli thought leaders and American thought leaders can work together now, like we are right now, that we might not have seen as so obvious 4 months ago? I think I'd like, because I'm an optimist against my better judgment, I'd like to think that those opportunities can present themselves and we'll seize on them.
You know, anecdotally, picking up on Eliot, over the last 3 months since this roughly began, you know, we've been involved in what we call bridging the divide work between American Jews and Israel for a lot of years now, and it picked up steam in 2015 with the freezing of the Kotel deal and the introduction of legislation that would have given unilateral authority to the Rabbanut over issues of Giur, of conversion. But my sense is, for a long time, we've been trying to engage with Israelis, and I've gotten the sense that there's been less interest of Israelis about world Jewry. Since coronavirus, the amount of outreach, Michal mentioned from the Jewish Agency and others, but much more grassroots. We have individual grantees, people that have gone on trips we fund for Israeli thought leaders to come experience American Jewish life and its reality. And everyone has reached out. There's a sense of arevut, of responsibility that we're seeing in this moment that Israelis need to have for world Jewry. Again, crisis unites. It's not clear how much of this will sustain if this virus is under control. But we've been struck by just how much of an interest there is now in Israel for the well-being of world Jewry, and particularly Jews in New York, who have been so devastated by this. You know, and Michal mentioned the new Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Omer Yankelovich, who's a Haredi woman, who came on one of our funded trips to New York to spend a week with the New York Jewish community. And, you know, I think these trips are invaluable. The problem is you have to have a lot of these trips, and it's sort of a retail way to try to change attitudes. But you come away from experiencing a Friday night tefillah at Park Avenue Synagogue or at Central Synagogue with a whole new appreciation for the sense that American Jewry is not disappearing, and that the stereotypes of, you know, we need to be safe from ourselves and Israel needs to come and protect us are just off, and they develop a much greater sensitivity for our needs and our issues in ways that I hope forges relationships going forward. So even pre-coronavirus, I think we were making small steps forward in having significant numbers of Israeli thought leaders understand in a much more nuanced way the reality of American Jewish life and not sort of the stereotypes that Eliot was referring to. And so I think there was progress before, and I'm actually hopeful that this event will lead to greater cooperation, a greater willingness to engage.
And I want to just echo the wonderful direction of this conversation and just pause for a moment, because the things that I spend some time thinking about as it relates to the Masorti realities on the ground. What do we tell the 800,000 Israelis who the JPPI, the Jewish People Policy Institute, who identify with Masorti and other liberal streams? What do we tell them when their rabbis are furloughed and their very small salaries are cut? Do we ask them to work for free to minister to their congregants, to the Kehilot, with no backup? We don't have there's no government support in this case.
Look, this is the fundraising, the financial impact of this pandemic is clear. Again, we don't know the severity. We don't know how long this is going to continue. We expect that the fundraising that fuels so much of Jewish institutional life will be significantly negatively affected, at least for the next couple of years, which will cause significant challenges to sustain the level of programming, delivery of Jewish service. On top of that, even beyond the financial challenge, summer camps are so critical to the Jewish engagement of younger people. Israel experiences are so core to creating a sense of connection to Israel. If you don't have camp, if you don't have Israel experiences, I have a daughter graduating senior in high school who's supposed to go on a gap year to Israel. She has no clue whether that program is happening or not. I hope it does in some fashion, but if it doesn't, how do you begin to substitute all of these critical methods of engaging Jewishly, connecting people for lifetimes? Camps for so many are basic. What happens to these camps? Will many of them survive? All the URJ camps are closed. The Ramat camps are overwhelmingly closed. Birthright trips aren't happening. Other Israel experiences aren't happening. What's the impact that's going to have on Jewish life and our connection with Israel?
Yeah, I don't have an easy answer myself. And Michal, it would be, Diane, it would be I don't want to give a pat answer. I'm deeply concerned because just speaking as one congregational rabbi, a congregational rabbi of a place called Park Avenue, which, if nothing else, its name sort of exudes a certain well-to-do-ness. I can tell you that all American synagogues are cutting budgets, are making sure that we're doing our darndest to retain basic services, and looking at the fall, not knowing questions about tuition and membership and fundraising and otherwise. I think that the question of, the long time inequity of I see Rabbi Futterman's on the call, Rabbi Goldstein's on it. My Masorti colleagues, many of them are on the calls right now. And to the degree that Masorti congregations or the Masorti movement depends on their budget, depends on philanthropy from the United States, I don't have a quick answer. Because right now, and I'm willing, Diane or Michal or Eric, to think creatively with you, because I'm totally committed And I also have some very real institutional concerns of my own. So it's might not be the easy pat answer, but I would rather be honest and uncomfortable than dishonest.
Very difficult for me to answer, and I don't think I'm the right person to speak about this, but and just the fact that Eliot is so hesitant makes me think why I'm not hesitant about this, and maybe I should be, but I have very, maybe because of my experience here and what we've seen here in Israel, with a lot of people being fired or kind of forced leave, and still asked by their respective institutions to work on a voluntary capacity, or for me, it's unacceptable. I don't think you can ask any person, even if they're on a spiritual mission, and regardless really of the importance of the substance of what the person is doing, I don't think that it's fair, and I don't think it should be expected of anyone to work free of charge or pro bono. I think I have a principal problem with it, especially because, at least here in Israel, again, from my experience, it happens to a certain sector, a certain level, certain strata of people in society. And I think that it's just unhealthy. It's an unhealthy situation. Shouldn't be expected of anyone.
Correct, but the systemic change that's needed in Israel, right, has the inequities that non-Orthodox educators, communities, rabbis face long preceded this moment, right? The funding imbalances are not new to this time. And so I'm not going anywhere fast with my thinking here. I'm just, of course, no one should work without compensation. But, you know, I'd be curious if my Israeli, you know, what would be the levers that American Jewry in this moment could pull on at the very moment that, you know, the Israeli government might be more, not less, might be less inclined to care, while there is a diminishment of resources on this side of the ocean, which might normally go to support conservative movement, Masorti, pluralistic efforts, right? This is like, I'm trying to problem solve here.
I'll tell you just from my conversations with the different position holders, from what I understood, and this is from a conversation I had today, one of these organizations has pulled together a fund, kind of a quick kind of funding mechanism, and recruited funds. And the idea, I think, and I'll tell you why I think this, is to provide the money to Jewish communities and not oversee the distribution or the allocation of the money into different aims and targets in the Jewish communities. Why I say this is because I've learned recently that the Israeli establishment was able to recruit funding for the catastrophe crisis that happened in Texas, I think last year. And I recruited, I think, to the best of my, maybe Eric knows better than me.
They gave $1 million from Naftali Bennett from the diaspora ministry to the hurricanes in Houston.
Okay, thank you. And the Israeli establishment was very surprised that after having given these funds to the Jewish community, the Jewish community split the funds with the local communities that were there. So part of the money that the Israeli establishment had forwarded to the Jewish community wasn't used for Jewish communal purposes, right? It was used for other purposes that the Jewish community saw fit. And this is why I think that in this corona crisis situation, if Israel and Israeli civil society, institutional, ministerial bodies were to recruit funds and forward funds to diaspora Jewish communities, I don't think, I would hope, and again, I think an educated hope, not just a random hope, that Israel would be wise enough to give the money and, you know, trust you to use and spend and allocate the money as you see fit. That's my hope.
So I'm going to pause for a moment and grab a question from our chat. This is a very engaging conversation. And I'll let each of you respond, and we may have to soon wrap up. So with thanks to Heidi Schneider, head of the board of the Massorti Foundation in the US. When Israel's ministries talk about their concern for Jewish peoplehood, do they understand that our understanding of peoplehood might be a little different? That Masorti identity is very tied to egalitarian and pluralistic Judaism? And how do you think that should play out?
No, definitely Israel. Okay, so one of the things that I ask when I speak to them, it's quite a defined research, and so I have a basic questionnaire, and so I ask the same questions, but the conversation always develops into different directions. But one of the questions that I always ask is, what are the challenges? I'll share two questions with you. One is I ask them if, you know, what does the utopian relationship look like? Is there such a thing as, you know, the kind of the relationship that we should strive for? Are there ideal relations? And another is, what are the challenges? So on the ideal relations, apart from one person, all of them really have a diverse outlook. Most people, most position holders that is, yes, don't want to define the relations. They usually say it's like family, you know, there's good periods, there's bad periods, there's disputes. There's no like one ideal thing. It depends who you ask, it depends. So very kind of dispersed, diffused answers. One answer that really struck me is that the person said to me, the ideal relationship is that diaspora Jewry will support Israel no matter what. So not compromise or not condition the Jewish diaspora support for Israel on a government policy, not vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not vis-a-vis pluralistic religious issues. Just be there for us. That is the ideal kind of utopic relations we should strive for. And in the same breath that he said that, he said, but I know that it's you know, if you asked me about something utopic and ideal, so I answered, but I don't think it's really grounded in reality. So yes, the government, ministries, and all the institutions that deal in a professional capacity with the relations are very much aware of the diversity. I can tell you that it's really apparent in the different ministries, the way they answer the questions regarding the challenges, that you can see which paradigm they're speaking from. Are they speaking from a peoplehood paradigm? Are they speaking from a Zionist paradigm, from a center periphery paradigm? And you have all of them. You have all of them in the different ministries. You have the same, in the same ministry or in the same institutions. In cases where I interviewed more than one person, you had different approaches. So we all people, and we all come with our own background as Israelis, as lots of people also in this industry have come from abroad, have made aliyah, and are now working on these relations. So there are diverse opinions. If there's anything that I can really vouch for, is that of course there is an awareness of the pluralistic and the different and the diverse communities in the United States, and the differences and the gaps in that respect with Israel.
Look, Michal gives a very lovely sort of nuanced answer to me, this comes down to politics and political interests. The typical minister who's looking for voters and support and constituencies doesn't see, I mean, I think they recognize the differences. I don't think there's any question that they understand how Judaism is different in America and in Israel in fundamental ways. And I don't think they particularly are overly concerned about supporting the kinds of egalitarian, pluralistic expressions of Jewish life in Israel, because their voters aren't pushing them to do it. And I think it's why it's critical. And to Eliot's point about how this is going to be more difficult in a resource-constrained environment, it's key. The key here is to develop facts on the ground, to have a stronger and stronger Massorti and reform movement in Israel, to have voters in Israel who live in Israel begin to vote around these interests. And until those facts change, we may at the edges, we've been involved in having some funding, not from the Rabbinut or from the religious ministries, but from the Department of Education for some non-Orthodox initiatives. But until you have political interests in Israel that in a significant way seek to promote these values, I don't think we're likely to see Israel change dramatically, even though I do believe that Omer Yankelevich, the new diaspora minister, notwithstanding that she comes from the Haredi world, was a member of Blue and White, and I think has a worldview that will be much more susceptible to thinking about how she can support pluralistic expressions of Jewish life in Israel than her predecessors, at least the last two or three. So we may actually see some glimmer of hope with the new Minister of Diaspora Affairs.
Look, I don't have much to add. My playbook when it comes to diaspora in Israel has been three principles. Number one, that sometimes you have to throw a flag on the field. When the head of JF&A, I don't know, Eric, if you were part of that group, but when the government reneged on the Kotel question, when you get out on a plane and you say you're losing us, when you write the op-ed, when you say this is one, American Jewry needs to be able to throw a flag on the field. Number two is what Massorti is about. I think you play the long game and you create and nurturing communities on the ground, grassroots, community building, period. And that's why the work of Massorti is so critically important. You create Jewish identity one person at a time. And then number three is whatever Vince Lombardi or whoever said, that the best defense is a good offense. I think the best thing that American Jewry can do to have Israeli, power structures pay attention to it is to be robust and strong on its own, which is frankly what I spend 98% of my day doing, of trying to build a vibrant, dynamic American Jewish life in my Arba Amot. And I think that's not just a dodge. I actually think that's a tactic. If the diaspora-Israel relationship is going to have a future, we have to make sure that there's a strong diaspora Jewry.
And with that, Rabbi Cosgrove, Michal, Eric, Gvirotai v'Rabotai, we're out of time. This has been a very exciting conversation, a lot of thought-provoking ideas. I will close with my favorite quote from our beloved maestro Yitzhak Perlman as the rain comes pouring down on my office window. Yitzhak Perlman, after playing a gorgeous symphony on only 3 violin strings, he said, "Our job is to make music with what remains." You have all shown us that there is possibility to continue to make great music together And I thank you, Eric Goldstein, Dr. Michal Hatuel Rdoshitsky, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, for enhancing our understanding with your incredible orchestra of ideas. We look forward to future opportunities together to learn together. Many thanks, and sending lots of strength and chizuk to everyone in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you all for being with us. Laila Tov. Tzoraim Tovim. Mamash Mikarev Lev. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Chag Sameach. Chag Sameach.